and welcome to Unity Temple. My name is Heidi Cooley. I'm the Executive Director of the Unity Temple Restoration Foundation, and we're so pleased to have you here tonight for such a special concert. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to a few of our funders, the Illinois Arts Council Agency, the Oak Park Area Arts Council, and the Alphawood Foundation. And wanted to mention that although this is the last concert in our chamber series, our annual chamber series, we will have a short series of summer concerts outside on the terrace starting in July. So all that information is on the back of your program. And also I wanted to mention, in case you're not familiar with our organization, the Unity Temple Restoration Foundation is a secular 501c3 nonprofit. We'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. So we've been around for a while, and our mission has always been to restore and preserve Franklin Wright's Unity Temple, which is a National Historic Landmark and also part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So, without any further ado, I'm now just really pleased to introduce a very important person here tonight who has underwritten this whole concert, and we're so thankful to have Sid Robinson here. Sid is an educator, author, and architect who's taught at Iowa State University, University of Illinois in Chicago, and at Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin. His books and articles on Wright, along with presentations at universities and museums, approach architecture as a humanistic art. And, introduction will be David Skidmore, of course, with Third Coast Percussion, which is a Grammy Award-winning Chicago-based percussion quartet and Grammy-nominated composer collective. So thank you so much, Sid Robinson and David Skidmore.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to be back in this very beautiful space and performing a work which will transport you to a different, very beautiful Frank Lloyd Wright space, Taliesin. And tonight we'll be performing the work that I composed in response to Taliesin. Originally composed to celebrate the centenary of Taliesin. And then Sid and I will have a wonderful discussion with all of you about relationships between music, architecture, and Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yes, since we know that Frank Lloyd Wright thought very highly of music, he thought of himself as an appreciator of music, and as his father described, music was an edifice in sound. And so the overlap between architecture and music is built into the way Frank Lloyd Wright thought of his work and thought of his architecture, and we'll be exploring what that might be.
Okay, so the performance of the work is about 45 minutes. And there'll be a very, very short pause, and then we'll have our conversation. So thank you once again for being here. And now I'll welcome the rest of my colleagues to the stage, and we will begin the performance. Thanks. So Sid Robinson. Sid and I are kind of prepared to have a little bit of a conversation about the piece, how it came about, ties not only between the music that I wrote in Taliesin, but of course what music and architecture kind of means in this space as well. But we also would love to have any questions that you all have. So maybe we'll start with a little bit of conversation, and then we'll have a couple of questions, and then we'll leave.
I brought my laser pointer so I can point to the architecture, because this is a pretty amazing space, as we all know, and I wanted to point out one of the great things about this. If you look at this portion of the building, you can see there's a pier, a structural element here, and then there's a cap that sits on the top. But notice how the ceiling pattern overruns that element, so that you have basically two things happening at the same time. You have the structure of the building, and then you have the ornament, which sort of ignores the structure. It doesn't reinforce the fact that that's abacus, but it overrides it. And so what you have is two ways of thinking about architecture overlapping one on top of the other. And I think, as an architect, I find that really fascinating, that it isn't clear what's being reinforced. It's two things happening at the same time. And I think there is some kind of musical analogy with that you can have two things going on at the same time. And Lord knows there were more than two things going on in the piece we just heard. But it's one of the ways we can overlap these two art forms. As I said, Frank Lloyd Wright was very much interested in music and doodled on the piano and so on, and listened, very thoughtfully. But one of the things that has been so fun over the years, this piece was composed 12 years ago, right?
Yeah.
When you were not who you are today.
Don't yourself regenerate like every 7 years?
Yeah, right. So it's a different person.
People.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so the idea of drawing analogy between architecture and music can be rather banal, shall we say. There's rhythm in music, and there's rhythm in architecture, and so on. We've pretty well dismissed that as not very useful. But the thing that's interesting is the compositional overlaps, that you can think about putting together parts of a building in a way that is somewhat related to how you put together pieces of music. And I wanted David to suggest or remind himself more than 12 years ago what it was about Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin that generated some responses as a musician to how to put together a piece of music.
Sure, yeah. So starting with what you were pointing out, there's there's more than two things. Let's say two things happening up there, which is that there's a structure and then there's ornament. And the ornament is going against the structure in a certain way. And the same thing, same analogy can be made in music. And I did that a ton in this particular piece, both with the notes, the pitches that I chose, and with the rhythms that I chose. So there are aspects of the piece that you just heard which are more familiar, and there are aspects that are probably less familiar. An example is the first time you hear drums in the piece, Peter was up here, he goes dum 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 cha dum dum cha dum 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 cha. That rhythm continues through the entire movement, the second movement of the piece. I think it almost never stops. But it's felt in 4 or 5 different meters, which for non-musicians is like how you count along with it. And so there's moments where you think da dum dum cha da dum cha da dum da, and there's moments where you think da dum dum cha da dum dum cha da dum dum cha, and there's moments where you think da dum dum cha da dum cha da dum dum, and it's more sort of irregular. So it's not as though one would hear that and say, "Oh, that reminds me of the column in Unity Temple." I mean, wait a minute, wait. It's not meant to be that kind of thing where you hear it and you say, "Oh, that's what," you know. But it's me as a composer seeing something in another art form and being inspired to create something in my art form that I wouldn't have probably made in the same way if I hadn't had the experience of really looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's work and talking to you so much about it. And then the one other thing I would say that's more specific to Taliesin is, for those of you who haven't been to Taliesin, it's in Spring, Wisconsin, and it's just beautiful. It's Frank Lloyd Wright's, it was his home and his studio in the warm months. And very different than this building. This building is very contained, and maybe Sid can elucidate more of this, but it was a job. It was, hey, build us a wonderful place of worship. It's structured like this, and Wright, had the people who were hiring him who were giving him restrictions, and he was imposing his own restrictions on himself because he was going to build it and then be done building it. Taliesin, he continued to build and add on to most of his life. So it's very interesting because you sort of look at it and it all makes sense. But then you start sort of finding your way around it, and it's easy to get lost, and it's like, why did we put that over there? And it's something that you like to say is that Taliesin was always changing, but it was always Taliesin, so it all kind of feels like it hangs together. It all feels very much like Frank Lloyd Wright, but it's a little bit sprawling in an interesting way. So with this piece, I was really interested in sort of creating an environment where we, as the listener, you sort of enter in to the space, and so there's music playing before the live performance happens, which you might have noticed in the pre-recorded audio. It was actually playing for like a half hour before the concert started, just like as you're walking in, you're sort of already hearing the piece and learning how to listen to the piece. And then in a very Frank Lloyd Wright way, you sort of turn a corner, and then all of a sudden, wow, there's a beautiful, room in here. That's true of this place, but Taliesin, I think about the entryway all the time, and it's we joke around that you have to be a certain height to enter a Frank Lloyd Wright building, right? Your head will kind of scrape the ceiling, and then you turn a corner and you have this grand living room. And at Taliesin, it looks like you're floating in midair because it's built on a hill, and there's just this sort of awe that's created by the way that he makes the space. So that's just one little way that I was thinking very specifically of Taliesin with that piece.
Well, it's interesting that Taliesin and Unity Temple are separated by about 5 or 6 years. So the same architect did a building which is very responsive to its national context. It has no axes. It has no unit system. It's very loose and informal, which is appropriate for a way of a person who's living and working there. And it's also an indication that Frank Lloyd Wright from the very beginning knew that Taliesin was going to grow and change. So rather than setting down a series of very clear geometric patterns, which were either going to have to be followed or undone as time changed, He produced an architecture which adapts to change and allows time to occur. Unity Temple is a resolved organic architecture. All the parts have been assigned, they've been aligned, the geometry, the axes, the symmetry is all in place. If you can imagine what challenge it would be to try and add on to this building. You just can't do that. But Taliesin could be added on for 50 years, as Frank Lloyd Wright lived there. And so what we have here is the same architect using very different architectural compositional models. One which is very loose and responsive to time and change, and one which is very fixed and organized and static in a way. And so we have organic of resolution, which is this building, and organic of evolution, which is Taliesin. And those two patterns of ways of thinking about composition clearly have implications in terms of composition of anything, including music. We have to realize that Frank Lloyd Wright listened to music. Frank Lloyd Wright was a pattern seeker. He was always looking for ways to organize and pattern. And that is, for me, one of the major overlaps of how you can have a composer look at architecture and see this pattern of passion going on in the way you organize sound.
Yeah, and the way that, one of the ways that I took that idea of pattern, and you know, the fact that it's regular pattern, and yet, you know, I look at something like that, this light fixture here, and I say, okay, I see lines, I see right angles, and yet if this is so, it's just me, but I could look at that thing for an hour and go home and try and draw it, and I wouldn't quite get it. It's regular shapes, but in an irregular way that just makes it continually beautiful and fascinating to me. And Taliesin is very much like that, because it is even more so because it is this sort of fluid thing where you look around Taliesin and you see geometry, simple geometry most of the time, and yet it becomes really wonderfully complex. And so in the piece we just heard, I take that idea and I use it in several different ways. So the very first movement, where we first started playing nice and strong and all the now keyboard instruments, we're each playing different numbers of notes. We're all playing 6 notes at a time, 4 notes at a time, 3 notes at a time. So it's either da-ga-da, 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 or da-ga-da, 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 or but we're never doing it exactly the same time. So the rhythmic language is incredibly simple, actually, but because it's layered and overlapped in this way, it becomes complex, such that to sort of extend the analogy, maybe many of you kind of like, as I'm sort of going da-ga-da-ga, you're reminded of the music itself. But I doubt anyone, well, I don't know if equal someone could, but I doubt anyone could go home and like write down exactly what we were playing, you know, the entire time. And that's the same principle to me of like simplicity layered in such a way that it produces complexity. So we're kind of invited in as the audience, whether it's architecture or music, by the simplicity, but we're continually intrigued by the layering of that simplicity in the way it creates complexity.
Well, and that points up to the interesting fact that the ornament that you see, these wood strips, were not Frank Lloyd Wright's first proposal for this building. He went through 3 stages before he ended up with this. And the departure from the original to the middle to what is here is an example of a creator evolving the way they're approaching the problem that they're facing. And so Frank Lloyd Wright, this is really, I mean, we're seeing the end product here, but it went through some interesting changes. And I'd like to ask David, you're listening to a piece that you composed 12 years ago. How does it sound?
The main thought I had is like, why did I make it so hard? No, it's I don't know, it's a really weird thing. I'm kind of just at a point in my life where I've written something that I still feel like playing 12 years later. you know, I wrote stuff earlier than that, but I'm kind of like, I don't know if that's it anymore. But I still like this piece. It's weird to go back and like revisit and it's like being a stranger, you know? Like I had to, and not only preparing to play the piece, but in hopefully preparing to say something interesting about it. I had to really look at it again because I don't remember anything actually. Luckily, I took good notes and you know dug back in and reminded of it. But what you were saying is interesting to me that these wood strips weren't Frank Lloyd Wright's initial design. We've also talked about how the exterior was originally going to be brick. Another amazing, seemingly simple but so important correlation between music and architecture is that there's an initial plan, and then all of a sudden restrictions come in, and you say, oh, I can't do that. And then it eventually becomes this beautiful UNESCO World Heritage Site building that was Frank Lloyd Wright's like fourth option. You know what I mean? It's funny to think that the exterior was actually, you know, originally meant to be brick, right?
Yeah.
And now I don't think anyone could imagine that because the outside is so iconic, this concrete, totally uniform facade. The same thing happens in music. There were early sketches of this piece. This happens with so many pieces that we write, where speaking of that first movement again, with 4s and 3s and 6s, there were early sketches where with like 7s and 9s and different numbers. Where I was thinking, oh, 3s, 4s, and 6s, that'll be too simple, it won't be interesting. And the more complex number rhythmic combinations I was coming up with were just impossible to play and sounded, you know, convoluted and not interesting to me or whatever. So there's this initial concept, there's this initial thought of what's going to be great, and then whether it's some form of practicality comes in and changes it. And thank goodness that it does, because that makes the thing what it actually is.
So, before we're finished, because I want some questions, obviously, is we want to thank the Unitarian Universalist congregation that is this building's source, and we're very grateful for their giving us the chance to perform here tonight, and the Unity Temple Restoration Foundation, which keeps this building and its architectural significance going. So we have its spiritual past and future, and its architectural past and future, and we are very aware of how grateful we are for the ability to participate in that in this form. So I would like to ask if you have some questions, because I'm sure David has said some things you'd like to follow up on. Please ask. Yes.
So I'll try to project it. Two questions that I got. The first one is, what influence did light have on your work? Because obviously in a lot of his buildings, light is a theme. I think in particular more in his later buildings, like the Usonian houses, where he specifically designed things. But even in this building, where they have just very particular windows and skylines, what influence did that have? That's the second question. And I don't know if you want me to go into it now or not, but the wind chimes, they were an odd addition in my opinion, just after this discussion, because they're kind of random. They don't have as much of a pattern. And where did the influence for that come from?
Sure. So the first question, maybe I'll start with the wind chimes actually, if that's okay. So the wind chimes are somewhat chaotic, uncontrollable thing, right? And I just love that because one of my favorite things about, speaking of Taliesin specifically, is that it was right, doing some things that were uncharacteristic of his other work, you know, loosening up, trying things, because it was his moment, his studio, to do whatever he wanted to do. And something about that, those little moments of looseness from this artist who, in my view, was so rigid, so controlling. You know, he wouldn't let you bring your own couches into his house, you know, whatever. He said, look, this is the couch. I designed it, it's perfect, you know, this kind of thing. So I love that freedom that Taliesin had to some degree, and I wanted something like that in the piece. And I also just find that in musical works where something spatially unexpected happens, it makes everyone aware of the space in a different way. So the fact that music starts to come from behind you, from the side or something like that, the performers start to walk outside, it sort of forces you to look at the space, and I knew that the piece would be played at Taliesin and in other architecturally interesting spaces, and I wanted to acknowledge that in some way. And I totally forgot the first question.
The light question.
You know,
And what's really interesting, and Henry Russell Hitchcock was a very eminent art historian who'd been all over Europe looking at modern buildings. And in a catalog for a show in 1932 in New York, he referred to this building, and he said, well, with the small windows, it must be very dark inside, which is just unbelievable because it proves that he'd never been here. And so for an eminent scholar to make an observation based on not having been there. So the point is that the introduction of light is really very compositionally obvious, right? At the top of the wall and the skylight. And so in that sense, there's nothing sort of experimental about it. It's just a natural consequence of where, I'll put it this way, where holes in the wall could naturally occur, or holes in the ceiling.
And I can't say that for me, the piece that I wrote, that light had a very specific influence, other than what I was talking about at the beginning, this feeling of, which is very typical of light, that you enter a building and it is purposefully contained and a little bit even dark, and then you turn a corner into the grand room, whatever it might be, whether it's the place of worship or the living room of Taliesin, and it opens up, and light, of course, plays into that. And I will also say that just from a very practical standpoint, it's really interesting because we rehearsed here all afternoon, and you'll notice we have these standlights, we put them out and said, it's bright enough in here. It's so interesting because I find myself like unaware of how much natural light there is in this building during the day. It's just so perfect. It's like, just you can see everything. And these lights are actually really lovely. I love the soft light. But it was interesting how much darker it was once the sun started to go down. Other questions?
Where at Taliesin has the piece been performed?
We performed it in the theater at Taliesin.
At Hillside.
At Hillside Theater, which is being renovated right now, so everyone go check it out. This is being made into a more modern performance space.
Well, have you ever performed at Taliesin West or just
We have, yes, we performed this piece at Taliesin West.
have you or any of the other members of the group composed any other music related to it or inspired by architecture?
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure, yeah, thank you. Yeah, the question was, have we composed any other music inspired by architecture? We haven't composed any, however, another wonderful architect named Bruce Goff, who was active in the Midwest and the Southwest and places, I'm sure, was also a composer and composed piano rolls. So you can imagine a player piano. He was an autodidact, both as an architect. He was self-taught as both an architect and a musician, but he composed music by punching holes in piano rolls into different shapes and sort of creating really incredible music that way. And Third Coast arranged Bruce Goff's compositions for our ensemble. So they're originally for player piano, but we this is another project we did with Sid. Because Sid's house was designed by Bruce Goff. So there's that architecture music connection that we made as well.
So in terms of the relationship between ornament and structure, so there's like for a section of music, whether it's ornamental or structural, do you think that is somehow inherent in music itself, or is that kind of a lot of composer to
Is it inherent in the music, or is it incumbent upon the composer to bring it out? Yeah, the question was about ornament and structure, I guess, right? And, well, I'll say that ornamentation in music typically refers to additional notes that embellish a main note, so to say. Not all music has ornamentation. There are styles of music where ornamentation is integral. Baroque music comes to mind. It's sort of a practice here's the melody, and you'll add extra notes around it to embellish the melody. Ornamentation in that way kind of comes and goes in terms of its prominence in music. It also has very much to do culturally with where the music is coming from. So there are styles of singing, for instance. I know Pakistani and Middle Eastern singing styles. There's incredibly ornamentation around the main melody, so to say. And I think that a composer sort of decides whether or not to include that, maybe in the same way an architect does. Because if you think of modernist or architecture, who am I thinking of? East Van Gogh, big block.
Nowhere.
No whatsoever. It's a choice, and it's the exact same with music, I would say. So in the piece that I just played, the last one, there's tons of ornamentation. Sean was right here with violins and all kinds of ornamentation around the melody.
My son had a question. What was in the pots that you brought up to the audience for us to hear?
Great question. Inside the flower pots
Inside the flower pots.
was BBs. Yeah.
How many?
I would say some dozens.
Some
We
dozens.
can count them afterwards. I don't know. Yeah, I'd say about 50. It's interesting. We do test. Pour a few BBs in. No, that's not quite right. A few more. Up too many. Take them out.
It was just right.
Yeah, we got it just right. Good question.
Yeah, did you ever take a trumpet lesson? Because your double and triple tongue is very good.
Oh, yeah. But they got, my first instrument was trumpet. No joke.
Was it? There
Yeah.
you go.
True story. You've got a good ear. All right, I think we've got time for a couple more questions.
So thank you for a great performance. I'm curious, question, Cindy, for you. Was this space specifically designed for acoustical properties? And did different iterations affect acoustical qualities? And then, as a musician, how does this space work for you acoustically?
I'll say that.
Please repeat.
Yes, yeah. The question was the space designed for its acoustical properties for musical performances? And that's the question for Sid. And the question for me is, how is it as a performing musician to play in here? And to answer that question first, it's a wonderful place to play. It's actually the kind of place where we walk in and we say, oh no, because this is a little bit reductive, but as a musician, we love walking into a place where everything is wood, because it just sounds great, warm, and carpet and concrete are usually a huge bummer. But something about this space, size of it, and maybe even the combination of concrete and carpet, but we can hear each other wonderfully on stage, and we really like how it sounds acoustically. And maybe these kind of folks here would be the best judge of this, but we don't think there's any seat house where it's too loud. But you can also hear the quiet, we can play as quietly as we'd like to as musicians. So it's actually just a really, and we had the great fortune of playing here a few times now, and we absolutely love it, sincerely.
Yeah, the question about the origin of the design is, Wright, in a sense, was a formalist. He liked patterns. And the consequence of those patterns sometimes was inadvertent. So the fact that it's small, that everything is facing in the center, allows sound to emanate in a very sort of even way. And so I don't think, Wright certainly said that the importance of the way this space was used was the voice, was language. And so the point was, someone standing there could be heard easily by everybody. And so that was a requirement in terms of the client, so to speak, of how it should work. And the very fact that, it's interesting, this part of the design, really, the main structure never changed. The one next door, the social hall, was something that made Brian very nervous. He couldn't figure out how to add a piece to something was so complete and central and concluded as this part of the building. And so this pattern never changed. I mean, there were details that changed over time, but the original layout was never really adjusted by any other external considerations.
I saw one more here.
I've got a
Up there.
comments and a compliment. The comment is in terms of subdivision and patterns and repetition, the marimba sure does look nice in this room. And the compliment, at least to me, I don't mean to take it down a notch, but I heard some echoes of a little Pink Floyd's time in there. Which, yeah, I think that's a compliment.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much for the
The comment was that the marimba looks great in this room, which I couldn't agree with more. We've actually played in Frank Lloyd Wright spaces in the past, and people have said that Frank Lloyd Wright designed the marimba. And he did. I wish he had, but it kind of looks, it fits in, doesn't it? And the compliment was that there were moments that reminded me of Pink Floyd Time, which I love. So thank you. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for being here.